Good afternoon and welcome to the session Breaking the Silos toward Multi-Hazard and Multi-Sectoral Approaches to Managing Risks. I'd like to welcome everybody, both those who are here in person and those who are online. My name's David Smith. I'm the Director of the Center for Environmental Management and Coordinator of the Institute for Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies, which has campuses in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, and an online campus. Today we'll be reflecting on themes which were raised in the Global Assessment Report of 2022. This report, as you know, was released by Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, and we're going to try to see how the increasingly complex and complicated and interconnected nature of risk is making us rethink the way in which we deal with risk, making us rethink the way in which we deal with disasters. We need to use a systemic approach and understand risk in a more systemic manner. The Global Sustainable Development Report, which was released in 2019, indicated that in terms of our achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, we are going to be facing four main barriers: waste, inequality, climate change, and the loss of our biological diversity. Further, many of the problems that face us in trying to improve human well-being are of different types. We have mainly gone and solved many of the simple problems, that is, the problems which we understand the solutions to and we all agree that we should solve. But there are many problems which relate to complex underlying systems and complicated ways of thinking, so people haven't fully agreed on what a solution would look like. It is therefore important in addressing those kinds of problems to embrace multi-sectoral and transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary ways of working. The problem with this and the problem with addressing systemic risk is that we're not used to working in multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary ways. Many of us are still very much in silos. And what we are going to try to talk about in this particular session, we're going to hear different experiences from people and their experiences with silos, with breaking silos down and finding more effective ways of working. We're going to hear about what the challenges are and what the successes might be as well, and hopefully learn some lessons that we can share with the rest of the world as we seek to improve our ability to manage risk within the world. The recommendations that come out of this panel will contribute in several different ways. It will be part of the work that's going to be done on the midterm evaluation of the Sendai framework. Recommendations will also go from this platform to COP27, which of course is going to be convened in Egypt later this year. So as we hear from our panelists and as we think through this, we should bear in mind that member states, the UN system, governments, whether they be national governments, local governments, or community-level governments, will need to learn more and more how to work in an interdisciplinary manner and allow, for example, our economists to be able to work very well with our scientists, and our social scientists to work well with our natural scientists, and our communicators to be able to work well with the people who take all the measurements. This thematic session then will showcase global, regional, national, and subnational practices in looking at multiple hazards and multiple sectors and using those approaches towards risk assessment, risk government, and how we would, in a transboundary way, address risk, as well as how we might address risk on a local scale as well. Our panelists are going to talk about good practice. They will talk about models that have been used. They may touch on things that have been tried and not. But as we move forward to trying to address this whole thing of systemic risk, which is a relatively new way of looking at how we deal with disasters, how we tackle with multiple hazards, how we tackle inequality in societies that tends to be something that disasters increases. We are going to try to explore that today. Now, before we hear from our panelists, a couple of housekeeping matters. In terms of our questions, there will be time for those of you in the audience to ask questions, but that will be done through Slido. So the Slido app is going to be something which you log into using a code, and the code is 2093018. So you'll have to get online and use the Slido app and use that code, 2093018. So, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, who unfortunately cannot physically be with us today, but his name is Dr. Peter Binder. He joins us remotely. He is the Director General of Meteo Suisse and the permanent representative of Switzerland to the World Meteorological Organization. He was also elected as chairman of EU MetNet. That is a network of the European Union Meteorological Services. He is also chairing the steering committee on intervention in natural hazards, as well as the National Center for Climate Services in Switzerland. So, Dr. Binder, we welcome your insights. I'm turning the floor over to him and over to Dr. Binder.
Dear participants to this session about breaking the silos toward multi-hazard, multi-sectoral approaching to managing risks. It is an honor for me to give this introductory talk. Silos is an important factor to achieve more effective results by warning and managing risks. I am active in this field since more than 15 years now. I will share some experiences with you of how we managed to break silos in Switzerland. My experience shows that breaking silos takes time and energy, but it's worth it. Let me give you 4 examples. In Switzerland, the responsibilities to cope with natural hazards are distributed over several governmental offices and university institutions. In order to provide a consolidated multi-hazard alert to the civil protection actors, the contributions of each office have to be coordinated and consolidated. For that purpose, the Steering Committee on Intervention in Natural Hazard was brought to life. The responsible authorities for weather, water, snow and avalanches, wildfire, earthquakes and landslides, together with the Federal Office for Civil Protection, form the said body. The committee acts on 3 levels. On each level, all institutions are represented. The Conference of the Directors decides on the strategy, its implementation and the financial resources. The implementation board carries out the projects, prepares the framework and the training for the operational tasks. In order to match the needs of the local actors at community level, regular meetings with the warning authorities are carried out. In case of an event, the operational teams of each participating institution cooperate to issue the multi-hazard warning and information bulletin. The cooperation, by the way, across ministries, has a legal basis and is formulated in a multilateral agreement. The success of the broken silos in the realm of natural hazard motivated to apply the same idea to climate services. Many sectors have a need for climate services: agriculture, energy production, public health, ecology, just to name a few. On the other hand, we have the producers of climate services, which often involves a variety of governmental institutions. Climate change modifies the risk map of many sectors. Decision makers on the political level need the pertinent information in order to draw the right conclusions for action. In order to foster dialogue between the 2 sides, we did build the National Center for Climate Services. This center is also based on a government decision. The participants represent 7 federal offices and 2 university institutions. Again, There is a conference of the directors for the strategies and an implementation board for the practical work. Regularly, fora and conferences are organized to identify and discuss the needs at the community level. The results of this cooperation are climate and hydrological scenarios, impact on forest development, impact on public health, preparedness of civil protection actors, and more. So far, I was talking about breaking the silos within the operational part of the federal administration. Now I want to enlarge the circle to the international context. We are striving to strengthen the link between the operational entities responsible for early warning systems and the entity responsible for international development cooperation. By doing so, we believe that the practical experience of the scientific and technical world can create benefit for the development cooperation initiatives and vice versa. Through a close exchange using a whole of a government approach, with a good coordination of activities, we believe to give more momentum and impact to the governmental efforts. We already have an example of success. The World Meteorological Organization, WMO, has responsibility for weather, water, and climate. The three disciplines are intimately linked in nature and therefore should also be in our scientific and operational treatment. This is the Earth system approach, indispensable for managing multi-hazard risks. This sounds logical, but there is an effort to be made and a mile to be gone. In Switzerland, we are currently pushing an initiative for the benefit of the UN and other humanitarian organizations, preparedness for natural hazards on the global scale. All available authoritative information on meteorological and hydrological threats from WMO members shall be directed into the information channels of the pertinent UN and humanitarian aid organizations. This constitutes a multi-organizational and multinational effort to mitigate risk-related meteorological, hydrological, and climate hazards. In conclusion, I tried to give you a few examples of our approach in Switzerland to master the meteorological and climatological risk related to natural hazards. It turns out that multi-hazard, multi-sectoral, multidiscipline, cross-risk cooperation is necessary, indispensable, sometimes tedious, realistic, doable, dependent on the willingness for cooperation of the responsible actors, of great value, finally successful in managing risks. Breaking the silos is a condition for success. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Binder. Thanks for those points. I noticed that you say that the cooperation is sometimes tedious, extremely necessary and absolutely vital. And many of us who've worked in ministries and different parts of government know how difficult it is sometimes to cooperate, even sometimes within your own ministry, with other ministries as well. But I think the points made about the legal basis for cooperation and the system that they've set up with regard to sharing meteorological information for the different clients that require it is extremely interesting and something which the audience may wish to think through and possibly pose some questions about when we get to the question and answer session later. I'd like now to introduce the first of our panelists, the gentleman to my right, Bijay Kumar. He is the Executive Director of the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction. It's the largest international network of civil society organizations that works to strengthen resilience of communities that are most at risk from disasters. It includes, I'm understanding, 1,300 organizations in 127 countries. So it's a formidable group. He leads the Secretariat and represents the Secretariat on its global board. Bijay works as the Executive Director of the Global Network of CSOs for Disaster Reduction. He's had a long track record in humanitarian and development work, particularly in DRR. He has considerable experience in leading and managing civil society organizations and networks. And this is in Africa, Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So without any more from me, I would like to hand over to our first distinguished panelist, Vijay Kumar. Please take the microphone.
Thanks, Dr. David. It's a privilege to be part of this panel, and I wish you all the best for anything and everything that you are doing to reduce risk in the world. Good afternoon, friends here, our co-travelers. Good morning and good evening to the friends who are watching us through the online platforms. There are many mechanisms which are in place to ensure what David actually talked about is the multiple risk, multiple factors, the way there are multiple hazards that we are exposed to. There are multiple vulnerabilities that we are actually exposed to in the various parts of our life, and how we make plans that take into account to reduce the vulnerability, reduce the exposure to the hazards, and try to see how we can do it better. There are multiple ways that is done. Let me share here one specific initiative that we as a global network are doing in partnership with the European Commission, the DevCo, the European Commission now, the International Partnership Department, also in partnership with Swedish as well as the Swiss government support. So that we call as the views from the front line. What we are trying to do there, we are trying to see how the various risks are understood from the perspective of the people who are experiencing it. So those risks, the priority threats, the consequences, actions, and barriers, and how the losses are changing over a period of 10 years, for a period of 10 years. That is what actually one part of the thing that we are trying to actually assess from the perspective of the communities which is experiencing these various forms of risk. The second category is that we are trying to also see that what are the various governance systems, the extent to which communities are included in the different actions, in assessment, planning, implementation, and monitoring of these risks. And we also are trying to assess and monitor that how there is, what type of enabling environment exists in the countries, which can actually primarily talk of the extent to which resources, capacities, legislations, leadership, policy coherence, and other factors are contributing to the inclusion of the local actors in building resilience. So this is what we are trying to do in 50 countries across the globe. And in each country, we picked up a representative sample from the various hazard context, the communities. So let me take the example of Indonesia. In Indonesia, we picked up the communities. It was done in partnership with the local civil society organization and the government, led by our member, Yakum Emergency Unit, which actually did this particular convening to assess the community's perspective. What happened that we actually picked up the various hazards categories and tried to actually pull together the perspectives that community had in terms of the various risks and various threats and the consequence that they're experiencing. And we also picked up the various ways that actually those consequences and impacts are addressed by the active involvement of community or not active involvement of community, either way, their participation in the governance system, and also see what are the enabling policies, environment. So based on that we came up with a report here in Indonesia, which was shared at the national level. I'll come back to that in 30 seconds. But what also, we actually came up with a global report. After we did that in 48 countries, we came up with a global report drawing this analysis. And these global reports primarily came up with 9 conclusions. The The conclusions included the complex threats and needs integrated solution, that we know it. There's a community exclusion was predominant, the poor planning and participation, responsibilities are not visible, that who is responsible for what. There's the information gap in terms of the community's involvement, and we also saw the absence of local funding. Resources were not located available for the response. There was a lost voices, and the development isn't risk-informed. And what we also saw, that there is an underutilization of the ecosystem and nature-based solutions. So these are the 9 conclusions that we came up with at a global level. What we found in Indonesia, that this particular process activated the civil society organization and the local government institutions to work together. The local government institutions, the private sector, the academia, the media, what actually is called here pentahelix approach, that they brought together to come up with the community's plans, and that was actually taken up at the national level to influence the policies, and those policies primarily can be seen as locating the resources at the community level in terms of the realizing the community's plans, and locating the mechanism to see how the community participation is articulated and brought out. So these are some of the processes that is done in Indonesia, like other 47 countries across the globe. So it is possible to bring the comprehensive analysis to inform a sustainable way of building resilience and strengthening the resilience of the communities. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, Vijay. Very interesting. I like the idea of getting down to the nitty-gritty of what people are thinking and what people's understanding of their own risk is. I think that's extremely important. And these findings of local inclusion or the lack of it, and people feeling maybe that certain things were invisible or that the risk was not informing developments in their area, I think is very, very instructive to us. So we'll be interested in hearing more from you a little later on. I would like to introduce our next panelist, who is the Chief Engineer at the Ministry of Irrigation and Water in the Republic of Sudan, Mrs. Nazreen Ibrahim Elzen. Was born and raised in Sudan. She has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Sudan University and a master's degree in water resources development and management. She has over 14 years of experience in the water sector, including working in many national and international organizations, and has been working as a hydrologist as well in the Ministry of Irrigation and Water Resources. As we know, water is an absolutely critical resource. Her job is to make sure that people get it, and we would very much like to hear from her. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. David. Assalamu alaikum. I'm glad to share with you our experiment in breaking Zolio's multi-hazard approach to managing risk. In Sudan, flood and droughts are the direct impact of climate change. It is frequent occurrence in recent years. Also, COVID-19 as a global pandemic, this results the loss of life, and priority is the loss of agriculture project due to drought. Also in Sudan, there are many institutions work in assessment and monitoring risk, like Civil Defense Council, and developing policies like Humanitarian Affairs Commission. The methodology of risk assessment is bringing all stakeholders like scientific and technical ministries, universities, research institutions, and expert judgment together from different sectors to managing a specific hazard. The climate information for Ministry of Irrigation and Water Resources from Meteorological Authority and Nile Water Directorate, and using data analysis and modeling for calculate scenarios of risk to determine the current and future risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm interested, I think we'll be asking more about the linkages with the other ministries, particularly education. That's something I think I would like to hear more about later on when we come to the questions. So I'll be talking, we'll like to hear more about that as well. As well, I think for many of us, the phenomenon of drought is a very difficult one because it's not one where you, like a hurricane or something where you know it's coming and then it comes. A drought is something, in a sense, you realize, oh yes, we may very well be in a drought. And it makes, I believe, I would imagine your job very, very difficult. And so I think we would like to hear more about that in the question and answer session. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
My next panelist is a registered nurse with a master's in public health. This is Mrs. Susanna Juanco, and she's chief of the training division at the Office of Civil Defense for the Government of the Philippines. Before she became the Director of Policy and Planning Services, which is what she is now. She spearheads the formulation of the Civil Defense's annual plans and programs, as well as the implementation of the Philippines' National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan. She also leads the conduct of research and studies in support of prevention and mitigation and policy development for disaster risk reduction. Her office also handles various institutional and international partnerships. Being a ERRM worker, she believes that little to no response is needed if we are better prepared. So let's hear from her. Susanna, if you could please elaborate on that.
Thank you very much, David, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Please be with me as we unbox the ASEAN's experience in breaking the silos towards multi-hazard and multi-sectoral approaches to managing risks. The ASEAN initiated cooperation on disaster management in ASEAN in 1970s. The cooperation gains its momentum to accelerate after the Indian Ocean tsunami, which provided an important lesson on the need to strengthen regional cooperation and institutional capacity to manage disasters in the region. The important milestone afterwards include the signing of the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, or the ADMER, in 2005 and its adoption in 2009, the establishment of the AHA Center in 2011, the adoption and implementation of the ADMER work program, the adoption of the ASEAN Vision in 2025 on disaster management, which envisioned ASEAN global leader in disaster management, and the ASEAN Declaration on One ASEAN, One Response. In addition, ASEAN also has 46 sectoral bodies, 16 centers, and 77 entities. Many of them have already played roles in disaster management in accordance with their expertise. Many others can potentially be utilized to support the strengthening of disaster management in the region. Disaster management in ASEAN is governed by an institutional structure. The ASEAN leader, which holds the highest authority, provides directions to ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community Council in implementing the ACC Blueprint 2025. The disaster management as part of the blueprint is taken care of by the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Disaster Management and the Conference of Parties to ADMER. They oversee and provide strategic direction to ensure ADMER full and effective implementation. The ACC Council, AMDM, and COP to ADMER, so many abbreviations, also work closely with the Secretary General of ASEAN, who also serves as the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Coordinator in the event of major disasters and crises. The ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management, or the ACDM, is the leading sectoral body coordinating the planning and implementation of ADMER and its associated AWP on the ground. They work together in the governing board of the AHA Center, who oversee the work of the AHA Center. The ACDM is assisted by 3 working groups, namely Working Group on Prevention Mitigation, Working Group on Preparedness, Response, and Recovery, and Working Group on Global Leadership. Each of these working groups oversees the implementation of 5 priority programs of the ADMER Working Program 2021-2025. ASEAN called for the multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder engagement in disaster management. Among the important calls are the ASEAN Declaration on Enhancing Cooperation in Disaster Management of the 23rd ASEAN Summit in October 2013, the ADMER Work Program 2021, which has included institutionalization, localization, and communication as one of its guiding principles, and the ASEAN leaders adopted Bandar Seri Begawan Declaration on the strategic and holistic initiative to link ASEAN responses to emergencies and disasters at the 38th ASEAN Summit in October 2022. This is a strategic, holistic, cross-sectoral, and coordinated approach across the ASEAN community to ensure ASEAN's collective, rapid, effective, and timely response in mitigating the impacts of the different types of emergencies affecting the region. Based on the needs and the calls for promoting multi-sectoral approaches, the ASEAN has established 3 cross-sectoral mechanisms to improve synergy and collaboration among different sectors. These are the Technical Working Group on Protection, Gender and Inclusion under the Working Group on Prevention and Mitigation, the Joint Task Force on Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief, which was established in May 2014, which is composed of the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management as the leading sectoral body. The last is the Technical Working Group on Civil and Military Coordination, which was established in recognition of the need to promote civil-military coordination in disaster management, particularly during disaster emergency response. As a whole, the ASEAN works together as one towards multi-hazard and multi-sectoral approaches to manage the risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that information on a regional approach to hazards. And I think one of the things we'll want to hear more from you about is how, since we know it's very difficult for people to work together in a multidisciplinary format, it must be much more difficult for countries to work in that way as well. So I think we will be anxious to hear how that works between different countries and whether or not it is straightforward or whether there are pitfalls. So our last panelist is Mr. Olaf Neusner. He is a disaster risk reduction expert, and he is based in Cebu in the Philippines. He's from Berlin and started working in the 1990s in the context of drought and conflict-related humanitarian aid for international NGOs. He moved to Southeast Asia in 2003 and has been working on a variety of training and other types of programs, including tsunami early warning systems. He's had many years of experience in disaster risk reduction, including looking at local flood early warning systems and landslide warning systems as well, and activities that cover disaster risk assessment. In addition to working in the Philippines, he's worked on early warning systems and has supported the development of early warning systems in Myanmar, Thailand, Afghanistan, Cambodia, and in the Indian Ocean. He's also been assigned at different times to Bangladesh and Vietnam, supporting risk assessments in urban areas and improving flood warning systems. He's connected to the German Committee for Disaster Reduction, and most recently has been working with UNDRR to increase the understanding of systemic risk under the Global Risk Assessment Framework. Olaf, please take the microphone.
Thank you very much for this lengthy introduction. So you know everything about me now. I would like to talk a bit about, say, disaster risk assessment methods. And you can imagine this as a toolbox that I'm the collector of tools. And I have actually two toolboxes. The first toolbox is the box for the primary effects of what is happening, the shock disaster takes place. So that is the physical impact that you immediately see when something, external shock is occurring. This toolbox is actually quite well equipped. So the say practical questions or problems that are arising are very often more that the data that are needed to use the tools are short supply. But the tools are actually quite well developed. What is in my second toolbox, which is everything that is happening after the immediate impact of a shock event, is what is not well developed and what is quite, say, relatively empty. That means we don't have very good methods, very established methods for systemic risk assessments yet. There are actually quite a lot of efforts, and the good thing is that many people have recognized that there is a need to do more about this, and there are different researchers and others who are working on that, but I wouldn't say that we have gone yet very far. So I would like to mention a few challenges that we have and a few opportunities. One of the big challenges is that once the initial impact has happened and the cascading effects are starting, the time is counting and the area where the effects are felt are getting bigger and bigger, which means the, say, effects are diluted because everything else is also happening, of course. So what I see in a development is not necessarily directly connected to the initial event that has happened, but could also be something else. So that is a challenge to filter out what is actually coming from the external shock and what are other developments that are happening in the world. So we are seeing some approaches on how to deal with that, but I wouldn't say that we have gone very far yet. The second is that if you are actually looking at many aspects of socioeconomic development factors and so on, you simply need a lot of data. And quite often we are challenged with environments which have only few data. So this is something that we have to also account into our assessments. But I wanted to also briefly go into opportunities we have. And you see that we have recently, say, 2 events in the world which are obviously having global impacts, which is the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in the Ukraine. So, and both are actually opportunities to with a lot of data. So there's a lot of information available, and I think researchers can now look into this and see what are actually really the cascading effects, not just say what is the primary impact, but you see how things develop. And so I'm actually quite optimistic that this will provide a good source of data, so to say, to see how global effects are unfolding and to see whether methods that we have are good to analyze this type of impacts. The second is that we can combine the initial output from a primary risk assessment with economic models. So there are actually, the economists are producing a lot of models of how things are unfolding within the socio-economic or economic field. And we can try to bring these two, say, if you want to put it like that, silos together, the disaster risk people and the economists, and see how we can bring the models developed by disaster scientists together with models from the economic field. One more thing is that we have potentially a lot of data we have to deal with, and which is not easy to understand. So the question would be, can we use machine type of learning, artificial intelligence, to help us understand this enormous wealth of data that we have, which could tell us about correlations and probably causal connections. And sorry. Sorry for that. I know that I'm now over time. And I think, different institutions like the UN and so on are in a good position to do that, but I am also looking for other institutions working on that, and I think we should exchange more and see how we can cooperate to solve this, say, right now, problem of developing good methods, standardized methods of systemic risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olaf. I was intrigued by the point you made about the figuring out what is caused by the event itself versus what might be caused by other matters going on at the same time. And the point you make about the need for data, and it seems to me that for many of us, as we're trying to figure out what the risks might be for particular events or particular types of events, that very often the countries that most need to understand risk and most need to understand systemic risk are also those countries which are least able to generate data for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because, let's face it, the amount of science in the world, scientists are not equally distributed on the face of the planet. Where we need many, many scientists in the developing world, they are not in the developing world. We have great scientists, but we don't have enough of them. As a consequence, we don't have enough scientific data to of the well-being of our citizens. And we need to figure out ways to be able to deal with that, because we still need the data in order to figure out the risk. And we still need the data to figure out the risk so we can deal with that and be able to ensure that we reduce the risk and allow for the well-being of our citizens to increase. So I'll be interested in hearing a bit more about information with regard to data generation and management. I think also it might be useful for us to reflect on the way in which data are handled within our own governments, within our own countries, within our own institutions, and whether we share data willingly. I am aware of experiences within countries, which I will not mention the names of those countries, but countries I've worked with where government departments literally have to buy data from other government departments. To me, as an academic, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'm not an economist and I don't work for the government, so there's a lot of things that don't make sense to me. But I would think that sharing data and a move towards open sharing of data is probably a very important stepping stone in ensuring that we become more understanding of systemic risk and more able to reduce disaster risk and to manage it better. We're going to have a few moments to talk to the moderator, to the panelists and so on, and then after that we'll throw open some of the questions which I have before me from the Slido. But before we get to the Slido questions, like to pose a question to Dr. Peter Binder, assuming that he is now still online. And the question I have for you, Peter, is what are the critical requirements to break down silos? And once you've broken down these silos, and you spoke about a very interesting system which you have in Switzerland, how do you make sure that the silos remain broken and that they're not simply rebuilt, you know, when possibly a government changes or somebody moves on from one government position to another or an NGO changes? How do we keep silos broken? Peter, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Hello to Bali. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this question, Professor Smith. So the factors needed to break the silos, I think the first one is really that there is a goodwill of the participants to collaborate. And then it is important to build trust between the people who have to work together. It has shown constructive that you start with pragmatic approaches, that you really start to work together, and then the supporting formalism I also mentioned that will then follow. Now, once you have broken the silos, a continuous effort is needed to avoid that these silos tend to re-establish. What helps is that you create some kind of standing structures, like regular meetings, do common preparatory work, that you perform exercises, that you have after event and after action reviews, so that you keep constant contact and that you are always motivated to think together and to improve the system as it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We will come back to you. I know that there are questions for you from the audience, but we're going to just go through the panel first, and then we will come back to you with some of the audience's questions. BJ, we're looking to improve systemic risk assessment, ensure that we're including everybody in our assessment of risk, and particularly people who have disabilities, but also people who are at the risk of being left behind for a variety of different reasons, and those reasons may vary from one country, one community to another. How do you make sure that nobody is left behind? How do you make sure everyone is included?
Thanks. That's one of the critical questions that we need to address. As civil society organizations, we have seen that we are better equipped to facilitate a process and unpack the various levels of vulnerability, because we know that all the community members are not equally impacted by any disasters or any form of vulnerability. I mean, not only possibility that they are critical group, but also the women themselves. There are minorities. There are discriminated groups which are completely out of the process which decides their fate. What will be primarily useful to ensure a process being facilitated by a group of civil society organizations which can bring voice to analyze the risk and also prioritize what can be done there. When they're analyzing the risk, they will actually see it from their perspective. Now that is the fundamental to actually walk extra mile to reach those communities and to reach those parts of the communities, otherwise you will be left behind. That is critical to actually bring them on board by going to them, by reaching them, by ensuring that we are positively discriminating in favor of them and bringing their voices to the process of analysis and planning.
And when you say the extra mile or the last mile, which we often use, that sort of always brings up in my head the idea of rural communities and going all that long distance. But what about urban communities? How do you see the same sort of process in urban communities as well?
Let's say, as we know, that in the communities, if I talk of the group that what we experienced in COVID, the people who are living in slums, they had a completely disproportionate experience of what was happening. How can you actually go for safe distance, or how can you go for cleaning your hands when the water is not available? So like one needs to actually see that how we actually reach and access them. And again, in the urban communities, I've seen, coming from the southern Asian part of the world, you will see the way the caste systems works, the way the untouchability works, the way the people are ostracized in various forms. And if you go to the Europe, where I live, so that you actually see the ghettoization and also see the various groups on based of color, based of racial groupings are actually staying and also are experiencing this. So one needs to identify those groups, and it is necessary to unpack or go to the nuanced analysis of the vulnerability and get into those groups who are experiencing multiple denial of rights and are experiencing multiple hazards and experiencing means multiple exposure to hazards, and their vulnerability is increasing because of other factors, including poverty, including HIV, including the health conditions. There are multiple factors. We need to go and actually reach.
Go. Okay, I see. I hear what you're saying. A question for you, and particularly for your country and for the region as well. What, if you had to suggest some practical things that could be done to help your government or other governments move towards managing multiple hazards, move towards looking at the different sectors that have to deal with disaster risk, could you indicate what you think are the most important things that could be to help move towards managing multiple hazards?
Okay, I'm working in Ministry of Irrigation and Water Resources in Nile Water Directorate. Nile Water Directorate is responsible of water level of Nile from he reach our boundary, Sudan boundary, to reach our neighbor Egypt. So we making a data, we collecting data and analyzing it. So we have some modeling show us the rainfall in Ethiopian highland. For those things, we know how the peak is coming and how we can operation our dams to mitigate the peak and to mitigate the flood from our towns.
Earlier on, Olaf was talking about data and information. And so my question to you would be, do you have enough information to be able to manage, let's say, the water sector? So you shook your head. Does that mean you do not have enough information?
You haven't enough data.
So what is the barrier? Is it that you do not have enough people to collect it? Is it that there are other insurmountable difficulties? If you were to be able to get the data that you need, what would you need in order to get the information you need to do the management of the water?
We need the cooperation for our countries and neighbors for sharing data and to solve this risk.
Okay, thank you. We will come back to that.
Okay.
Susanna, you talked about the experience in the region, in the ASEAN region. Could you share a couple of lessons which you think would be most important to people from outside of the region, for the people in the audience?
The ASEAN experience that I have elaborated, through the experiences that the ASEAN, when it comes to response, have learned, is that the disaster risk landscape is becoming more complex and challenging. there's a need to strengthen and broaden cooperation, not only internally, that's within the ASEAN region, but also externally, and that would include even the non-traditional partners. And this is a must when it comes to, if we really wanted to break the silos. We should not be working not only within within our country, but also in collaboration with other countries, and that also of the other sector. One case, for example, is the mechanism that I have mentioned a while ago, is on the Joint Task Force on Humanitarian Assistance. This being led by the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management. But when it comes to response, this is participated not only by the Disaster Management Committee, but also this being participated by the other sectors, which has contribution when it comes to disaster response, and that would include even the political sector, even the defense sector, the health sector, and also the social welfare and development. Now, all of these sectors, if we'll be working together, which is a lesson learned in the ASEAN, is that we shall be having, as what we call it, the ASEAN, one response.
Okay, thank you very much. How, I won't say easy, but could you mention one barrier that kept coming up? You seem to have managed as a group of countries to be able to do some things very well, but what is one of the most problematic things, one of the things that was stopping you from being successful?
I think, especially when it comes to response, even though some of the countries, if for example, a country has been affected by disaster, even if all the ASEAN, the members of the ASEAN countries would like to help or respond to that country, we still need the yes, the go signal of the political leader or of the person or the high official of that country in order for other countries to enter and give assistance to that country. I think, but however, when it comes to what ASEAN had done, the ASEAN Committee had done, this is slowly being addressed to, and the AHA Center is one of the agencies who's doing now the collaboration when it comes to that. So it may be a problem, but now this is being addressed too. That's why when it comes to doing the response of one country to another, doing it now, I would say that we do it seamlessly, but at least there is the easy part on doing it.
Okay, thank you very much. I raise the question of data again, because I think it is incredibly important. Olaf, you can't assess systemic risk without good data. And a lot of countries do not have the data, as you'd mentioned already. But on the other hand, there are plenty of places which do have data. I'm told reliably that there are some internet companies and so on which have access to what we sometimes refer to as big data. There are satellites everywhere. How can big data help understand risk? How can big data help us to reduce risk, especially in places where we can't go out and collect the data ourselves? And there are a lot of countries on the planet which are not in the situation to collect data. What can big data do to help them?
I mean, there are two aspects to that. The first is we have to have the data. So maybe from satellite or remote sensing or so, we can gather some, but I think it's only some. And I mean, social media or whatever these companies are collecting is another set of data which is most likely not accessible. And I also don't know to what extent it would be really helpful. And the second, the question is, where does the data come from? And the second is, do we have the tools to digest them, the analytical tools? And we don't have them yet, at least not in an established way, in a tested way that we would really say this is in many countries they used that and it always gave good results. So there are initial attempts to tests or tries to develop such models which can give that, but very often the problem is that we don't have enough of this data. So it will start for sure in countries where we have a lot of data. So that is, yeah, the developed, industrialized and so on, Western type of countries. And if we there see, okay, a certain type of tool is working, then we can see, okay, we need these data in the countries which are data starved or so, or don't have data. But first, I think we have to start where we have simply a nice collection. And but it's two things. Tools are not there yet very well, and data probably not. But probably they are there, and we simply have to use them.
Okay, thank you. So do you see a role for training in the use of large data sets and getting that kind of expertise out there, or is that something that maybe has to wait until we figure out how to manage the data in the first place?
In a way, yes, but I would actually right now say it's more the time for the researchers to develop good tools. If we have tested tools which are nice, then it's more, say, the rollout phase and more the training capacity building phase. In general, of course, we can also say we have to train everybody and also in using this type of big data. But I think right now it's more the development phase before the real rollout phase.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very interesting. One of the things that happened after the large earthquake in Haiti in 2010 was that a group called Flowminder, working with University of London, was able to track where people ended up after the earthquake. So it allowed people who were involved in carrying out relief operations to take the relief to where people actually were, as opposed to trying to just scour the entire island looking for where people ended up. And that kind of information and the use of anonymized cell phone data has an incredibly high potential for understanding people's movements, understanding inequalities, understanding the level of development for different communities, and is definitely something I think should all be looking at using much more, because particularly in countries which are data poor, that's one source of data which could very well help quite a lot. We're going to change the pace slightly and go to some of the questions that were posed through the Slido, and just reminding people that if you have questions, put them up on the Slido app, and what you can do there is indicate your question, and if it's to a specific panelist, you can indicate who you want to answer that question as well. So going to the top of the list, Peter Binder is the panelist who gets the question. And the question is, how critical is the role of the Ministry of Finance in breaking silos and the way in which silos work within government? What's the role of the Ministry of Finance? Are they important in breaking silos? Peter. Have I lost Peter?
Can you hear me?
Seems that we may not. Yes, we can hear you, Peter. Please go ahead. Did you hear the question?
Yes, I did. I got the question. Yes, thank you for that one.
Okay, please go ahead.
I mean, in the operational world, the finances are not immediately involved, but of course the finance minister has to enable that the structures can be established. If I refer to early warning systems, for instance, of course the finances have to be made available that all these systems can be built. So I would say the finance ministry is really decisive in making the resources available, but then in building the systems which have to work for early warning systems, or in an event case, then it's not of an immediate importance. Then there are more the warning systems, the civil protection authorities which are in charge.
Thank you, Peter. Do you think, as a follow-up, that the Ministry of Finance then can help to keep the silos broken?
Yes, that's certainly important, because this financial support is continuously needed. Also, if you want to extend the systems, to improve them, you always need financial support. And so I would say the Minister of Finance is always in the game.
Okay, thank you. Another question to you is, I believe, from our colleagues in Indonesia, who are asking you, what is the experience regarding data integration for multiple hazard early warning systems in terms of meteorology? They mentioned that Indonesia uses the pentahelix in breaking silos, and so they're asking what sort of experience did you have in terms of data integration for multiple hazards and early warning systems?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It goes also towards the question you already raised about data sharing. And I think, first of all, that's a very important point. But again, I think there we are not where we should be. So data integration did not fully happen. There's a stepwise approach. Sorry. A stepwise approach, but we still have to further develop that. Even in Switzerland, data are not freely available, so there is now action underway to improve that system so that data integration is easier, and I think it's needed. It's really still under development, but a very important fact to improve these overall silo-free systems.
Thank you very much. The next question goes to Nazreen Elzen, and it has to do with infectious diseases. So the question says, how are you considering integration of infectious diseases in your warning systems, and how do you account for the environmental drivers of infectious disease? And presumably one of those drivers would be water availability. So how are you considering the integration of infectious diseases and the way in which they are driven in terms of the way in which you look at hazards?
In Sudan, where is heavy rain, in season rain, from July to September, if the heavy rain became, we know that there are many diseases became from broken area or from pool of water, because the water stays long time in a hole. After that, we make a committee from Ministry of Irrigation and Ministry of many sector to solve this problem.
And do you find your Ministry of Health works closely with you in terms of managing water? And you mentioned particularly the important health aspects of water, in the sense that some diseases are borne by water, and of course water is important for health. Is there a close relationship between your ministry and the Ministry of Health?
Yes, I think in Sudan there is the cooperative were many Ministry for Health and Ministry of Irrigation. This is so good.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
BJ, what are the barriers for ministries to look at disaster risk reduction from a human rights-based approach? Do you see barriers there?
Yes, I would actually put it that way. that the rights are the basic condition to live with a dignity. That is the definition of rights. And rights are to be protected, respected, fulfilled by the state, by the ministry. Then it automatically becomes their responsibility to deliver it. That's what the fundamental thing. And the rights are not compromised during the disaster or before the disaster. So if from a rights-based perspective, it actually gives the ministry an added advantage if you are actually including that in the disaster prevention. So that actually it is easier for you to handle that during the disaster or after the disaster. Yeah. Okay. So there should not be a barrier. If there is a barrier, then perhaps there is a need to invest in creating that opportunity for the ministry to understand what we mean by rights and how these rights, if not taken on board, what will be the consequences of that during the disaster itself.
Okay, thank you. Susanna, there's an audience member who's asking how intergovernmental agencies working with national disaster management authorities can break silos in regional and cross-border hazards. So, in a sense, does it help to have a regional entity involved in this? Does that make breaking the silos easier?
Yes, I do believe so. Because the regional entity will be the one who will lead the convergence of all the agencies, both in the countries and that of even in the national government. So it's the regional counterpart, or it's the regional office who shall be the leader in order to have the convergence among all the national players, or even all the players.
Okay, and do you think then that a regional organization can keep the silos broken?
Sorry, again?
Can a regional organization help governments to not create the silos back again, to keep the silos broken once they have been broken? Or is that something that maybe a regional organization should not get into?
We cannot say that because, of course, nothing is gone. Because in breaking the silos, what we need is for everyone to learn how to share and everyone to learn how to accept. And that being the region, there should be, as I have mentioned before, one who will lead in the convergence. So if the region is able to help in breaking the silos, I think that the region should not also be the one to help. Should also be the one to help, not again having silos among all the other countries.
Okay. Thank you very much. Other questions from the audience? And these are to all the panelists, so anybody who would like to answer, please, by all means, feel free to do so. And so the first question in terms of the entire panel is, in the context of breaking silos, who owns the key performance indicators? I think that's what it means. It says KPI. So who owns the key performance indicators of disaster risk reduction in a formal government regulation? That sounds very much like somebody who is within a government asking a very important question. If you manage according to key performance indicators, who owns them? Once you've broken these silos down, then who's responsible for making sure the work is done? Anybody who would like to attempt that question? I think we're... Go ahead, yes, of course.
I'm not from the government, yeah. I was working in the government plus for 35 years back. So my exposure to the government is limited. So the way I see it, that if the communities is involved in planning a disaster risk reduction, then what matters at the local level is integration. So the community's perspective is integrated into the various ministry programs, and that is delivered at the local level. So that is where the local level KPIs should be integrated, adopting an integrated approach. At the national level, then when you are talking of the various ministries, various global frameworks being pushed through the various ministries, That is how it operates. What actually is required is the coordination. So the coordination among the various ministries. And that is where I see that in the structure, there's a role for the DRR group, wherever it is sitting, should we primarily be coordinating the risk-informed development being integrated into informing those processes. And at the global level, we create the minimum silos because we sign the different agenda and the different framework, and that is actually pushed through the various UN systems, and that does create silos. But as what is actually required at this point of time, that there is a need for communication among the various global actors. So that is what, for example, UNDRR has the way it has started, that how it is integrating DRR into the climate change discussion, integrating DRR into the SDG discussions. Perhaps that is done through a communication process. So at the local level integration, at the national level coordination, and at the global level communication needs to be, and that should be featuring in the performance indicators or the key performance indicators of all those people who are accountable for that.
Okay, thank you. Olaf, were you coming in on that, or?
I mean, I'm also not in the government, so I'm not not in the best way to probably answer that. But my feeling is that the ownership of data would remain the same. So the health data are produced by the Ministry of Health, and the Health Ministry is responsible for the quality of these data. But they should be accessible to everybody, and the other institutions, whether it is a disaster agency or others, should be able to access the data and use the data, and they should actually also be encouraged to use the data, that they don't say, I only use my own data. So this is, I think, the approach. So the ownership, I think, is not touched by this breaking of silos, but to open the data, that is the decisive step.
Thank you.
I am the one who is from the government. I am from the Office of Civil Defense in the Philippines. I think when it comes to the performance indicator, the one who will be owning the performance indicator will be the department who is handling the disaster management of that country, or of that, where in the Philippines, it's the Office of Civil Defense who is handling the disaster risk reduction and management. But basically, when we talk about performance indicator, I think the one who should, personally, I think the one who should really be handling when it comes to owning the performance indicator will be the people who will benefited when it comes to how we work together and how we break the silos, and that will be the community themselves who will be greatly affected, are able to reduce the risk whenever there are disasters.
So you feel then that if the communities are doing well, that then reflects well on the government and the NGOs that are involved. But if the communities are not doing well, then it means that the government and the NGOs still have a lot of work to do.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Okay. How does science play a role in all this? There's a question here that says, how useful are scientific disaster scenarios in critical actions to reduce risk? How useful is science to help everybody see risk and work together for disaster risk reduction? This is a question to anybody. Some of you are scientists. Some of you, like myself, were scientists a long, long, long time ago, and now we don't know what we are. But what is the role of science? And particularly, how well is science communicated so that people at the community level are able to take advantage of scientific knowledge and use it to improve their well-being? Anyone want to answer that one?
I mean, it is a well-known, say, bottleneck of disaster risk management, how to communicate the risks or warnings and so on. And so I think everybody agrees that we still have room for improvement there. And answer is also breaking the silos, that not the scientists alone are communicating the results of their work, but they work together with media or, I mean, many others to see how this gets across, so that the message that is coming out of scientific research or services is communicated in a way. But I mean, I think it's not a new problem. Really, many people recognize that there is a bottleneck.
There's an interesting phenomenon about COVID, which I think the world learned, which is that even if you have scientific information, that doesn't necessarily change the way people behave and doesn't necessarily influence the way in which decision makers at the top of political organizations actually put things into place. And we saw a variety of different approaches by countries around the world, some of which were highly ineffective and some of which were highly effective. And we run the entire gamut of countries with less than 20% being vaccinated to countries with very, very high vaccination rates. And I think if we can figure out what happened, we would learn an awful lot, because it's no doubt applicable to many other situations. I saw two of my colleagues on the right coming in, so please go ahead to answering the question about the role of science.
It's a very fundamental question. It's a question of how we link science to the experience of community experiences, of people's experience. COVID is a typical example. If science would not have been effective, we would not have been sitting here today. The vaccination, the process, the way vaccination was usually done, and the way it was usually put together so quickly within such a short period of time, that it could be actually possible. Otherwise, it would have been difficult. Now, climate change, the impact of the climate change, we would not have been actually experiencing, we would not have been recognizing it without the scientists, by the way. We recognized it, they have a role to play, though we experienced as well. That also had a role. In my understanding, what is actually required is to see how science and people's lived-in experience interact. And then it is not either or, it is both. The meteorological information, how that is used to process by the community's own experience to change its behavior is fundamental. Okay. So that is what I would see, that is how I would see as the linkages.
All right, thank you. Nazarene?
COVID-19 is a global pandemic. All countries close her border and scientists make a vaccine. Vaccine is too good thing for help and save for life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can I
yes.
also add?
Okay.
When it comes to the role of science, I think science is very important if we wanted to make a very good scientific risk assessment of the hazards and the vulnerabilities of the people or of the community. And that is what we are doing in the Philippines. We have this GRS PH, wherein this is the one being used by the local government units. So they're looking at the vulnerability and the hazards in a certain community, making the science in order to make the risk assessment, and thus making it as a source information in the development of their DRM plan.
Okay, thank you. So we have, I think, time for maybe one last question, possibly two. And there's a question here about youth participation in disaster risk reduction. How could youth participation in disaster risk reduction be extended to being part of the policy-making process? Does the policy-making process at the moment only pay lip service to youth and youth participation? Or do young people in their countries have a meaningful role in shaping policy? How can we help young people play a more meaningful role in shaping policy? I'm not hearing anybody rushing to answer this question. Go ahead, Susanna.
Okay. I think how we can, are we saying how can we involve the youth?
How can we make sure their involvement is meaningful? How can they shape policy?
The youth. The first is we should educate the youth first when it comes to DRRM. And we all knew that youth are very good advocates when it comes to if they really wanted to play the role of the advocacies that they wanted to have, youths are really very good advocates. So how can we do that? First, we really have to educate the youth, and we should make them partners in every thematic pillar of the RRM. So that's, I think, through that way we can make them as policy advocates.
Okay, so the idea is give them meaningful roles, make sure that that's built in, and ensure that government continues to listen and actually put those policies into place. We're drawing close to the end of the session, so I'm going to give the panelists 30 seconds each, or maybe a sentence or 2 sentences at the most. And the idea is to say the thing that you want the guys who are recording the session to put into the record of the meeting that gets passed on to the higher up people who are going to read this and put this into action. So everybody has a sentence, or at the most 2. I'm going to start on my far right with Nazreen, and then we'll come down to BJ, Susanna, and finish with Olaf. So Nazreen, please. And Peter, you will have the final word. Okay.
Okay, my sentence is more cooperation for sharing knowledge between us from risk to resilience. My sentence is. Thank you.
Listen to the voice of the communities, local authorities, local actors, and allow the civil society to facilitate that process, which will bring a coherent, joint actions and involves an all-society approach. Sorry, my English is bad, so it became a little bit of a longer sentence. Yeah.
Disaster management should be everybody's business. Anyone could contribute to disaster management based on their expertise. So instead of working in silos, interoperativeness and coordination should be the essence of our DRM initiatives.
As I told you, I'm working on kind of a toolbox, and I'm interested in other people who have also tools, and I would be happy if you get in touch with me to share tools. Thank you.
Thank you. And Peter, your 30 seconds.
Experience shows that cooperation across administrative boundaries, the silos, needs a continuous effort, but more integration of the disciplines is necessary. Formal decisions from governments and/or formal agreements between parties are a great help to open the silos. However, the constructive attitude and willingness of the parties to cooperate is decisive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I want to thank all the panelists. So thanks again, Peter. Thank you, BJ. Thank you, Nazreen. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Olaf. You've shared a lot, and I believe provided some interesting areas for thought and challenged us in terms of things that could work, things that are providing challenges, and areas where we really do need to focus so that we can address systemic risk properly. And I hope that the audience was able to profit from the answers to your questions. I want to thank the audience as well for joining and for participating in the Slido. The next session will start in 45 minutes' time in this room. So thanks again to everybody, and let's really work together to tackle systemic risk. Thanks again. Goodbye.